and we're just waiting for Kate and India. And
Is my mic okay?
Facebook's, yep, sounds good. Facebook glitched on us, but we're used to disaster. So if you'll just bear with us 1 second while I get this invite sent to India. Okay. Can you hear us okay out there? Hey, Northern Autie. Excellent. Okay. And Jude and Sarah, I muted you because your mics are getting doing the echo thing, but just unmute yourself when you're ready to talk. Welcome back, India.
Hello.
Sorry about that, but it looks like we're good to go now and everyone can see and hear us okay. So, India, do you want to tell us just a little bit about what OCD is?
Of course. So OCD is classified as an anxiety condition. Um, it's characterized by a set of obsessions and compulsions, hence the term obsessive compulsive disorder. Um, it is the 10th leading cause of disability in the world, according to the World Health Organization. So it's pretty prevalent. And it's really, really distressing. And I think there is a big gap between people's perception of what OCD is and what it actually is. And my social media account reflects this all the time, is that OCD is often trivialized, and it's often seen as something that's quite eccentric. But in fact, OCD can be really, really dark. The obsessions can be around harm to self or others. There can be obsessions about abusing people, about killing people, really serious illness. Obviously, the more commonly known subtypes such as contamination, and it can be around sexuality, it can be around gender, pretty much anything. But what we have noticed in the past few years, and it's really interesting, is that the media plays a role in the development of new subtypes of OCD. So you can see that people have developed subtypes around the worry about abusing children, because that's often in the media, around terrorism, around being cancelled, and around sexuality and gender. So I've seen in the 20 years I've been practicing, I've seen a development and a reflection of what's going on in the media, reflected in my client's presentation of OCD.
Thank you so much. And you said canceling, and I wanted to bring this up because it has been a fear that I have. I'm autistic and have quite a few communication disorders to go along with a traumatic brain injury and from meningitis. And so I fear that my social differences, which do actually get me in trouble a lot, because other people don't understand and they project onto me what they think I mean or am implying when I don't do implications. If I don't say it, I don't mean it. But and a lot of times people just say, I can just tell from the way that you said that you feel that you're superior, or it's different things, or you think that you're on a pedestal, or I'm pedantic. But that fear of being canceled can be logical for some people, especially autistic people who have had a lot of social conflicts. But OCD is different from having a rational fear. Can you talk a little bit about how to tell the difference between actual OCD and having a real fear that is totally understandable given somebody's circumstances.
Absolutely. Well, I explain it like this to people, that when you have OCD, these kinds of worries are life and death. And I do believe that in every OCD worry there is a rational perspective. Let me put that another way. Every single OCD obsession and fear and worry, it exists in the world as a risk or as a fear. I mean, there's certainly no way that I could disprove any of my clients' fears. There's some possibility that their worry could exist or could materialize. So I never invalidate it that way. But what I do say to clients, the difference between what they're worrying about and the extent to which they're worrying about it does differ from what we call the more neurotypical people's worries. And so let me give you an example. So if someone with contamination OCD worried that a door handle, say, would be contaminated, that may occur to somebody without OCD. So they may go into a hospital and think this might be an infectious area. There might be risks here. I feel a bit awkward about doing those things, but they probably would be able to do it. If you say that to someone with chronic contamination OCD, it does feel like life or death, and they won't be able to do it. It's not I refuse to do it in the way. And this is very similar to autism. It's not can't, and it's not won't, it's can't with OCD. And I could offer my OCD clients, I could say to them, look, I'll explain to you the rationality, and I never do that, by the way, but that's most people's approach to it. I'll explain to you why this isn't dangerous. How about, say I could give you £10,000 to not carry out your compulsion? They would say, forget it. Or $100,000. They say, forget it. I don't want the money. The risk is too great. That's the difference.
Okay. That makes total sense. And you have responsibility OCD. And I think that a lot of autistic people will totally relate to that. Can you explain what that means?
Absolutely. So 70% at least of our clients have what we call responsibility OCD. You see this term used less these days, but it's still really relevant, because now what's happened is, as we've progressed in terms of treatment and clinical understanding of what OCD is, we've definitely disseminated OCD into subtypes. And there are various subtypes of responsibility OCD that actually gain more media attention. So that would be things like POCD, paedophile OCD, harm OCD, and various other. Actually, to be honest, cancelling OCD kind of comes into that category. So responsibility is when somebody with OCD usually has fairly poor self-worth. So they've struggled with their self-confidence and their self-worth. And I always say, of course, that OCD is probably, and we don't know exactly, but there's probably a biological origin, but the type you get is environmental. And so this is where this issue about poor self-esteem and poor self-worth comes into determining and influencing the type of OCD you get. So responsibility OCD is when somebody with OCD places everyone else's happiness, welfare, and safety above their own. And so what they will do is they will worry about offending people, about killing people, about harming them in other ways, about being cancelled, about generally being offensive, or doing something that would embarrass or humiliate their family, work colleagues. So it comes up as well in areas of, say, sexual harassment. During the Me Too movement, and of course that's still relevant, a lot of my clients started presenting with worries that they'd sexually harassed someone, with absolutely no evidence that that's the case. But we saw that kind of worry start to manifest. And that's what responsibility OCD is. It's when you are hyper responsible. Young mums suffer from this a great deal. Not only Are they vulnerable in terms of their hormonal changes? But they start to develop worries that they might harm their child, they might kill their child, they might sexually abuse their child. I mean, it's very, very distressing.
Thank you so much. And I think that, every time somebody talks about OCD, I'm like, yes, yes. And these are things that a lot of autistic people have been told this is just autism. And parents of autistic children get told this is just autism. When their children are experiencing extreme distress. And so I feel this is such an important topic for us to discuss with the autistic community. And one question that we have that's come up a lot is, can there be an overlap between OCD and PDA? And PDA stands for pathological demand avoidance. Sometimes we just say demand avoidance, but it's more than just avoiding demands. It's like a paralysis and an inability. And when you said, if you offer somebody 10,000 pounds or $100,000, they still can't do it. That's more like PDA, is that just, when that demand is there to do something that's causing you anxiety, or even sometimes something that you want to do, but there's that demand there. Can that be OCD? Because we know of it as compulsive actions that you do, but can it also be things that you can't do as well, that you get like a paralysis?
The truth is, we just don't know. There's been more research into autism than there has been into OCD, and it's contentious. It's a problem. From my clinical perspective, I actually am not sure, but I do think that the answer lies in the origin of the fear, and I suspect they might be different. So I suspect that the worry about demand avoidance in autism is a general inability, and I'd love somebody here to really, see if this resonates with them, because I'm very interested to know. There's kind of a general, I just can't respond to those demands. I just can't do it. Again, it's not a want. I don't want to. It's I can't. They're not able to respond to those kind of very rigid, very demanding situations. There's kind of a, oh my God. With OCD, I think it's slightly different. I think that there's a very, very specific fear behind them not being able to do things. Now, the outcome is very similar. There is a stuckness, there's a paralysis. And I remember it from my days with OCD, being stuck in one place. I'm literally unable to know what to do. And with OCD, there's a polarization between frantic attempts to mitigate their discomfort and then a complete paralysis. So I think that the paralysis with OCD is the result of a very, very specific fear. And that fear might be, if I do that, I could die. If I don't do something, someone else could die, or I could lose it. Usually there's a few fears behind OCD. They fall into various categories. They fall into the suffering forever category. They fall into the being a bad person or not being good enough, and that's where the harm OCD comes in. Or it falls into this kind of losing everything kind of category. But that's too general. If a person with OCD is paralyzed, there will be some specific worry sitting in those categories. And I don't think that's the same for autism. I think it's different. But please tell me, because, I deal with autism alongside OCD, whereas for you, you're dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. So I'd love to know what you think.
As a person who is PDA and OCD, and also autistic and ADHD and some other things, I definitely feel like they're the same. They're related. It's a cluster of neurology there that I see in my child as well. My child will very much want to do something, and if I phrase it the wrong way, like, okay, let's go to the car now. PDA means pathological demand avoidance. If I say, let's go to the car right now, and she wants to go somewhere, suddenly I've introduced that demand, and I see her just kind of freeze up, and she starts getting anxious. Her speech isn't as clear as it was sometimes. She's so frazzled and frantic all of a sudden that what comes out doesn't really make any sense. And so
Can
I
I ask
feel
though, does
sure.
she know why she can't do it?
In those moments, she can't explain anything coherently.
But with OCD, my OCD clients would know why they couldn't go to the car.
Right, and she might know, but she can't explain. And another thing is alexithymia. Are you familiar with that?
I mean,
That
I know
is
roughly what it is.
an inability to
Yeah. Express your emotions, articulate them.
identify, yeah, what it is you're feeling. It takes me a long time to process what I'm feeling and why, logically. So I start getting the extreme anxiety of things a long time before I know why I'm anxious. Even with physical pain, I can have cuts and burns, and I start feeling anxiety and discomfort, just bad in general, but not knowing what it is or why until I physically see, until my eyes see a cut. And then I'll start to feel the pain in that location. And with emotions and even logic, sometimes, anytime I start to get overwhelmed, I just really can't identify what's going on for a while, or know why I can't do something that I badly want to do, like even sending an email. There's a stress there. There's probably a logical reason, but I can't always get to it until I do a lot of like downtime in the dark with no other stimuli so that I can process through all that. Did anybody else have something they wanted to add? Go ahead, Jude.
For me, it makes me think a lot of where I've done been doing a lot of research and introspection and really understanding my OCD and also my other conditions, but also understanding how my comorbid conditions affect each other and how, since a lot of times, since they have overlapping symptoms that are very similar, but also how it's like, oh, you can't have this certain condition because you have these certain symptoms, you do these actions, but it's actually more, it's from another condition that you have. Like for me myself, I was able to get ketamine therapy, and that's what really helped with um, to help get my the obsessive thoughts and compulsions under control to a point that really helped me understand just how much of my life was directed by that. And so, but after sort of not having that constant cycle going on in my head, like pretty much all the time, it made my other conditions more prominent. Like, oh, including like my reaction to medicines. Like I take stimulants for ADHD, but before I didn't really want to take them because it made my obsessive thoughts worse. Like it's like I don't, it's, but my focus wasn't as bad because it also felt like the accommodations I made for myself to be able to go through my OCD without stressing myself out with more of, it helped the executive function that came with that really helped keep my thoughts together. So it's like I seem to be functioning well and being a good producer in this society. So like I won't take stimulants. now after the ketamine therapy and a lot of healing that came with that, and with the obsessive thoughts being a lot more under control, for me to be able to go through life with less stress and harm and trauma from trying to fight it. Even my hunger cues, because I had an eating disorder that was induced from the OCD, my hunger cues are completely different. Like, just eating one thing feels completely different from when my obsessive thoughts felt like they were a bit out of controlling my life, to the point where it always had to be that cycle, and fighting that cycle hurt me even more. And it just felt easier and less stressful to go through that cycle until I found support and resources for it. So it really helped me understand more how having these conditions all together, especially since a lot of these are stress and trauma and anxiety inducing conditions, that it can make it hard to even understand that you have more than one, or that you might have that, because its combination with the conditions together looks like something totally different. It looks more like you're functioning fine, rather than you're extremely stressed and going through this cycle. But because it looks healthy, because you're able to produce, you're able to work a job, because you're accommodating for that all the time, that it looks completely different.
I mean, Jude, you bring up something really interesting there, and it kind of to tie that back to the question about demand avoidance is, we have only been studying OCD with autism in the last 10 years, which is pretty, disgraceful, really. I mean, it's a real shame. But I think what we need to do here is distinguish and talk about what you're talking about, which is comorbidity. And so we don't know whether the, OCD with autism displays completely different symptoms than OCD on its own, and OCD and autism on its own. So what they're thinking is that OCD with autism produces a different set of symptoms. So that's really interesting when you were saying with your daughter to get her in the car. Now, if I said even to an 8-year-old with OCD and said to them, why can't you go in the car? And they would say to me, because on Tuesday, so-and-so got in that car from my school and they contaminated, and I saw that they even touched the handle, and there's no way I'm going in the back seat. So they would know exactly. So what I'm saying is, if you have OCD and autism and can't express that, that might mean that OCD comorbid with autism produces a different set of symptoms, because of the autism plays the role that, listen, I can't express that. I'm just not able to.
And I think that, going back to the PDA, I'll ask Kate to read this question from the audience, because I feel like this almost answers the question about how PDA can feel with OCD.
So the question's from Cara. I feel as if I lose my free will due to intrusive thoughts and impulses. And the impulses are impulses to hurt myself, even maybe getting me to believe in a thought or a concept that's dangerous for me. I'm not a self-harmer, and I have no idea why this happens. Thank you for any response, because it horrifies me.
And I think that right there, that saying, I feel I lose my free will, that kind of is how I feel with PDA and the paralysis. I can I can love someone and they say I love you, and then I feel the demand to say it back. And so I become paralyzed and I have zero words, or I know that they need me to say something, but in that moment I become paralyzed, because it's like, if I feel that I lose my free will, I can't. It's not can't. I mean, it's not won't, it's can't. I literally just can't make myself do the things. And so, yeah, I'll ask India to answer that, though.
Well, I mean, you want me to answer this question from Cara, yes?
Yes, please.
Right. I mean, with certainly I can answer from an OCD perspective about this. So, can you just put the question up again for me? Sorry.
Yeah.
Just to make sure I'm answering the right thing. What can happen with OCD, and we've seen it quite a few times, is that, especially with responsibility OCD, There's a moral and an ethical overtone to it. So it's a little bit different to some of the other types of OCD because there's this sense of I'm actually a bad person. So with some of the other types of OCD, the underlying worry might be, I'll suffer, I'll die, I'll never have certainty, I could lose everything. But with responsibility OCD, there's definitely this sense of I'm not a good person or I could be a bad person. Of course, they're not. And that's just the OCD talking. So this sense to harm themselves and this sense to punish themselves is quite strong. And when I was a youngster I suppose when I was having my first responsibility OCD symptoms around probably 11 to 13, and I thought that I could harm children, my get out clause was, if there's any way that I come close to that, I can just take myself out of the equation. And that was my backup plan. And that was some form of self-harming that I was considering. And so what people with responsibility OCD tend to do is they think, well, if I hurt myself, it slightly eases the anxiety. It slightly, I don't know what else to do, but what I can do is just hurt myself. And actually some of that self-harm might be to just get rid of the thoughts. I do have OCD clients that just bang their head against the wall repeatedly. I just cannot think this thought again. I just can't deal with anymore. I need to ease the discomfort. And sometimes the pain of self-harm actually eases the discomfort. And you see that very much with things like borderline personality disorder. The harm is in some ways is kind of it's a release from the discomfort and the anxiety.
And with autism, there are a lot of people who do self-harm, and I'm covered in scars, and there would be times that I would get stuck in what I now understand as a motor loop. I had never heard of this even when I learned about autism in grad school, which anyone who's been in grad school will know, and I'm sure that OCD is the same, that what you learn in academia is totally different from the lived experience that you get from participating in the community. So the communities are going to be far advanced and more nuanced. But motor looping happens to a lot of people with apraxia, which is the inability to execute purposeful motor movements. And it usually comes with motor disinhibition, which is also doing movements that you don't want to do. And we see things like skin picking, and I forget it starts with
Trichotillomania, yeah.
Yes, pulling your hair out and things like that can be similar to motor loops. But like I would be sanding something and I just could not make my body stop doing it. Or I would have a toothache and I could not make myself stop making it worse with my hand. Like I would just keep digging until it was like a horror movie. But I was horrified at myself, but there was nothing that I could do that could make it stop. When my health has been poor, things like that have been much worse. And I know now that I have an autoimmune condition that the inflammation can be so bad that I'll be inflamed around the meninges, around my brain. So it's like getting meningitis without an infection. And we're seeing in PANS and PANDAS and autoimmune encephalitis, people diagnose that mistaken diagnosis as autism because they have these repetitive behaviors. And that's not to say they're not autistic too, because we're prone to autoimmune conditions and, we can have finicky health issues. And so, but yeah, there's often, medical conditions that can underlie this. But with self-harm, when you feel to harm yourself or you do harm yourself, that releases endorphins in the brain that are similar to morphine. And that can calm that what we call a neurological storm in the brain, where your cortices, your left and right hemisphere, are not syncing up and you're about to have a meltdown, or you're just suffering. You can't get your brain under control. Your mind and your brain are different again. And your mind is your conscious thoughts, your personality. Your brain can be on the fritz and go work against your mind. And so that self-harm can be your best effort when you don't have better tools at self-care, actually. So that's why we call it non-suicidal self-harm, because you're actually trying to save yourself from suffering so much by getting that endorphin release. And when I did DBT therapy, we would sometimes tell people different ways that you can kind of get that release without causing any permanent damage. If you're punching your leg, that's a lot better than concussing yourself by banging your head against the wall or cutting yourself, the things that can cause you more serious harm. Or eat a really, really hot pepper. And that can also give you that same chemical release without, or working out to exhaustion can get your brain back in. But that can also become OCD, where you start working out to the point of exhaustion and beyond too. So yeah, there's a lot of overlap. We have some great audience questions, but I wanted to get to Sarah first because we have had a lot of people talking about rejection sensitive dysphoria. And Sarah has been posting about that recently on her page. And so do you want to take the floor, Sarah?
Sure. First, India, are you aware of that term, rejection sensitive dysphoria? Okay. For those who might not be, it's just that dysphoria is a burden. It literally means a burden. And it's this intensely uncomfortable feeling when either you have been rejected or you perceive a rejection. And the thing that's important for people to understand is the perception of rejection is just as real as an actual rejection to that traumatized brain. And what I'm finding, just listening to you describe responsibility OCD, it sounds very similar to that experience where we are so focused on pleasing other people, making sure the situation around us, the people around us are not going to reject us. And the reality is that for so many of us, especially those who are undiagnosed as children, if we were rejected, that could mean death. We could be I was a very medically fragile child. And so if I was rejected, I wasn't being taken care of. And, it just kind of kept going. And so for me, one of the most healing things first was to admit that I had rejection sensitive dysphoria. I didn't want to admit that because I felt like admitting that would make people reject me. So it was very overwhelming. But one of the most important things I learned was I am not my thoughts. And I heard you say that, so when I had these rejection thoughts going through my head, a lot of times I would find my compulsive behaviors would be around ending or controlling a rejection. So I had to do something to either reject myself or reject the other person. I would not really reject the other person. It was more about situating myself to be rejected. And so I just kind of want to ask you, so I am not my thoughts has saved me to realize that these thoughts are coming from a brain that is what are you doing, brain? It's an organ. And I'm this is not, a thought that's helpful for me. To telling myself that my brain's a liar. you know, like just really kind of like making it into something separate. For people, rejection sensitive dysphoria can be just debilitating. So what are some other methods and strategies that we can use to support ourselves in those moments when we are experiencing RSD, or maybe it's responsibility OCD?
Is that a question to me, Sarah?
Yes, India. So yes, my
Sure.
question is, yeah, what are some good strategies when you're in that moment, your compulsions are pretty loud?
Well, firstly, brilliant. You know, a great technique is to say, I'm not my thoughts, and you know, these thoughts don't mean anything. And that theme runs through our treatment as well. So you've done extraordinarily well. And if you're communicating that on social media, brilliant. The message is great. So that fits very much into the therapeutic areas of what we do, which is cognitive behavioral therapy with a strong emphasis on ERP. And then we also use something called acceptance commitment therapy and mindfulness. And so yours is very consistent with acceptance commitment therapy and mindfulness. We would absolutely say to clients, instead of, oh my God, I worry that I could kill someone, it would be, I'm having the OCD thought that I could kill someone. So we definitely use that. We definitely try to create what's called cognitive distance. But what we also do is we make sure that we apply that not only to thoughts, but other personal experiences such as emotions, feelings. And sometimes people with OCD get images. Sometimes they get auditory hallucinations and mild hallucinations and visual ones. So they can apply it to any of those and create distance. So they might say, instead of, oh my God, I'm so anxious, we could say, you know, I'm having the feelings of anxiety. We do teach that. We teach that in kind of a step process. So initially we would work with clients for CBT, with a strong emphasis on ERP, which is the only as yet evidence-based intervention in the UK for OCD. And in the UK, Kate will know this, that we work according to what are called the NICE guidelines, which is the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. So it does say very specifically that CBT plus ERP. But now here's where it gets complicated. For OCD with autism, or autism with OCD traits, we think that CBT might be less effective. So we probably wouldn't do CBT, certainly in the same way that we would with someone that was just suffering from OCD. And obviously, sometimes, you know, that there is, as you say, you've all said quite rightly that there's overlap. You know, and I'm not sure whether trying to unpick them is actually that helpful, but more about that later. I always look at symptoms. I kind of, and I do think that assessments in the future will be symptom based and probably not so label based. But anyway, that's a different topic. So we would come at it, Sarah, with CBT for OCD, but we probably wouldn't do that for OCD with autism. So there is scientific evidence that it doesn't work in the same way, and for all the reasons that we've discussed tonight, that there's a certain stuckness that we see with autism. There's a stuckness with OCD, but it's a little bit more pronounced with autism. There's an inability to articulate in some cases what people are feeling. So what we would do, instead of doing straight up CBT with some strong ERP, which could be, I think, fairly difficult, borderline traumatic, because it's very uncomfortable ERP, what we do with our clients who have OCD and autism is we'd use a different delivery system. So we'd use ERP, but we'd deliver it in a certain way. We certainly wouldn't do group work, because those kinds of settings would probably not be helpful. We'd do very close individual work. We might present it with more visuals than we would usually. We would concentrate on making the task very specific. So, for instance, with responsibility OCD, which is what you were mentioning, exposing people and also obviously the rejection, and we call it also disapproval. We would expose them very gently to very safe disapproval. And we would also engage them in that process, and we would ask them, what could we do? And rather than say, listen, because we don't want to get to demand avoidance, we say, listen, you go, you do this for your homework. They'd be like, no. So what we'd do is we'd negotiate with them and talk with them and say, what do you think you could do safely? So I was dealing with a client actually recently, and they have OCD and autism, and they said that they find it very very difficult to wear the wrong thing, and it's kind of approval based. So they work in a setting with their peers. They're quite young, they're at college, and if they wear the wrong socks, it's incredibly distressing for them. So I was talking to them, look, how could we, so with someone with OCD, I'd probably say, look, I'll come with you, we'll wear the wrong socks, I'll be there, we'll do it together. I wouldn't do that with her. So what I would say to my client is, look, what could you do that would get us to that point? And I might suggest something like, could you wear the one wrong sock at home, where you're in control and you're not actually with your peers, and build it up? And she said, I think I could do that. I think I could. I said, well, why could you do that for 10 minutes? And she said, yeah, I think I could. I said, could you think that you could see building that up to maybe wearing one wrong sock to college, even if you take the right socks and you change when you get there after a certain period of time? She said, yes, I think I could. So so what you have to do then is you just have to work more slowly in cooperation with your client. And sometimes rewards really help as well, that you would offer rewards, and you would do it in a slower, more linear. You break it down into simple tasks, and I would never do intensive work in the way that I would with people with just OCD. So sorry, it's a really long answer. So just in a short answer, we would start with CBT plus ERP gently. We'd then move through to acceptance commitment therapy, which is a bit less structured, which is what you're talking about. I'm having the thought that we may even introduce some DBT techniques for those overwhelming emotions. And then finally, if our clients could manage that, we'd move to some mindfulness. So we might introduce, and I don't do meditation with my clients. It's too hard for both my clients with OCD and my clients with OCD and autism to do, is I do task-based mindfulness exercises. And I would do that with them, with things that they resonate with. If they're musicians, we would do a mindfulness music task. If they were artists, we'd do that. And we'd set some home ones as well. So sorry, long answer, because I'm a clinician. I've gone off on a tangent, but that's it.
Hey, Jude.
Honestly, thanks for the tangent, because all of it was like meaningful for me, honestly. Like, especially with going through a lot of mental health professionals, a lot of, like, even when I was diagnosed with OCD, at the same time I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and overall depression, and they focused more on bipolar disorder rather than the OCD in the first place, and I didn't concentrate on it either. So I'm getting a lot of treatment that's based off now. It's more with, I don't have bipolar disorder, but I have been diagnosed with ADHD, autism, mood disorder, PMDD, which a lot of these things are a lot of times misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder. And so a lot of times having treatment that's only based off this one thing, that's what it looks like, it doesn't work for my other conditions. It doesn't work for how my brain is wired that way. And then it's very much made towards getting advice from people who is like, oh, well, I'm autistic too, but they don't also have OCD. So they tell me how I should work through something, and I'm telling them that it's harming me, that I can't do it this way. Like, don't tell me that I haven't tried. Don't tell me that I haven't tried not to think about this, like, or that I haven't tried not to be stressed about this. Like, don't tell me how to deal with something that you barely know anything about, or you have this very abstract meaning of how it's about, and you don't understand how it's affecting me physiologically. So because they don't have that understanding and more want to put a boundary or a barrier up so they don't have to have that understanding, especially when a lot of times it may be hard with our different forms of communication, that someone who does like being the fear of going off on a tangent a lot of times because people stop listening to us. But I feel like a lot of times, sometimes I am going in a circle, but a lot of times there's meaning to it. That's how my brain process works. And I feel like every part of it is important, but I would be able to negotiate my needs with someone so that we can communicate together. But because they're only coming from this one perspective and one understanding, they refuse that understanding and communication and say that it's me or like people like me that we're not putting in that effort. When I'm paralyzed, I am stressed out, I do self-harm cycles because I am more stressed not doing them and not having that support in accommodation, not having those resources. So because I don't have that, I am stuck in this harm loop that is honestly one of the main things that is keeping me alive right now. Like, I also have intracranial hypertension, and I can tell a lot of, like, it's an indicator for my stress because I can feel the cerebral fluid. It sort of feels like flames on my brain. So I can feel it welling up, and it's sort of like a physical indicator that a lot of people may not have because they don't have intracranial tension to measure my stress. And so it's also a very misunderstood and very generalized condition focused around like weight and saying if you lose weight that it'll go away. But I have an OCD induced eating disorder that I'm in. I'm a very stressful and traumatic situation. So that's attributing to my weight gain. And I'm still stressed, and you're not addressing all of my conditions. So all of the things that you're saying is that it's just affecting my weight when I have a lot of these comorbid conditions that are actually causing my weight gain, and not the intracranial hypertension itself. And what's getting that under control, the intracranial hypertension is still there. That now my hunger cues are different. I don't have that obsessive compulsion. I'm not fighting those. The intracranial hypertension is still there, but I'm actually finally, for the first time in 15 years, I am not controlled by thoughts of food and cleaning over and over. And somehow I'm able to eat healthily and without guilt, and I'm able to lose weight. But the problem that you told me and put on me to blame me that it's okay for me to endure harm because it's myself, because I am fat, because you consider me obese, because I'm not eating right, I'm not adhering to this one set of standard that I'm telling you is harming me. I still have this condition, and you have not given me the help or the research or need or the digging or accommodation that I need to survive. So I've had to hurt myself and navigate the least stressful way. And I think it's so important, pretty much everything that you said, that understanding, like, it's not a matter of won't, it's that I can't. Like, there was no, like, I did all of like the dissecting of like accepting my body, and a lot of toxic positivity is like, oh, of like going more than worth and just say you're beautiful, and that's all it takes. But it wasn't. Like, all of this, when I was pregnant, it got worse. And I not being able to stop this harmful cycle with my children who I love so much, like, know that I could not stop until I actually had the proper support and resources, and somebody listened to me to actually help me in the way that I needed, not this one size fits all that hurts us. So thank you.
Jude, it's not you. It's not you. It's us. As you know, the psychology therapy industry, the psychotherapy industry, it's that their understanding of comorbidity is poor. The research is poor, and we have a lot to do. And don't get me started on the DSM-5 criteria, because I just don't believe it. Sorry, I see Kate nodding. I just think it's garbage. How dare they think that mental health is a binary thing that you either do or don't have it. It's all dimensional. It's all absolutely cross complicated. Sorry, it's my own phrase. But yes, what they need to do with you, Jude, is sit down and say to you, right, Jude, what is causing you the most problems? What do we need to address? What do you think we should tackle first in the priority, rather than doing this kind of clinical hierarchy that's been dished out when we've trained? We need to sit down with you and say, what would you like to tackle first? And how are we going to do that?
You know, you mentioned it really struck me with the socks and your autistic client, because that was, and trigger warning out there. I'm going to mention thoughts of wanting to die. But it has a happy ending, so there's that. But when I contacted the DBT therapist who did save my life, the first thing I said was, if you can't help me, you are my last stop. I can't suffer this much anymore, and I am going to, not in an impulsive way, but just make the decision to end things because I can't keep living this way. It is way too hard, and no one can see how hard it is for me to survive. But I went to work at 8 o'clock. It took me 5 to 10 minutes to drive to my job. It wasn't very far. And I had a very low maintenance routine to get ready. But I had to be up at 4 a.m. to make time for all of my compulsive behaviors and OCD. Every morning I would have multiple panic attacks over my sock drawer, and it would take me at least an hour to choose my socks. If I did not choose the right ones, and it became more complicated, it had to be put on at a certain time. Like the time could not have a 1 or a 3 or a 6 or a 9 in it. If it did, or a 4 and a 4 beside each other, it was very specific and it kept getting worse. But I thought if I had the wrong socks, my dad would die. It was always my dad. I don't know why. Or I would end up in prison, or someone I love would end up in prison, not because I committed a crime, but because it was the wrong socks. And it would be if I drank from the wrong color of a straw.
Yeah.
If I wore the wrong outfit, it made no logical sense. And the DBT therapist that I worked with, he did not talk emotions ever to me. And that's really, I don't know if he was like that with everyone or just me, because he perceived that I couldn't process my emotions. And that was a big source of my stress. I still can't. But I've learned to be okay with my logic. So he would logic me. He gave me a giant jar of pennies. And he would say, now let's talk about the likelihood that X is going to happen. And we would look up statistics. And he would be like, okay, so here's a penny. And he would mark on it and say, you have a 1 in 400 chance. Now, put this 1 penny in this jar of 400 pennies. Shake it up and pull one out. Now pull another one, pull another one, pull another one. And you never got that 1 penny out of the 1 in 400. And so when you have poor executive functioning, you can't see the steps from beginning to end. And everything feels like 50-50. A disaster, or, it's going to be okay. And he helped me to process the in-between steps by giving me a logical framework. So a lot of times when I empathize with people, I give them statistics. And I know that they're looking for emotional validation, but I'm really not very good at that. But when I give them my statistics, people call me Bernie Sanders because he always spouts off and has a million statistics memorized, but that's my love language, because that was a way that I could logic myself through when I couldn't identify my emotions. And I didn't have the executive functioning to see all the steps between things will be okay or things are going to be a disaster. And so I could logic myself, and it became. And another thing was, and a lot of autistic people have severe trauma around religion. And that was a lot of, I grew up in a very religious, not just family, but my whole entire world, the whole area. It was a backwoods, very rural, very evangelical, fundamentalist religious place. And I would just there were a lot of things that once I started to lose my religion, I still had all those superstitions of, like, if this is a sin, even my thoughts are a sin, and bad things are going to happen because I've upset the universe or whatever. And so that was just, when you said the sock thing, and helping someone by just putting a sock on and experiencing that, hey, nothing bad happened, I can do this for 10 minutes, and giving them that choice. That was, I felt like that was a great strategy that would have helped me, and it was similar to what did help me. And so we have some other questions. I'm going to pop one up on the, oh, thank you. Go ahead, Kate.
I beat you to it because I think there was a piece in what you were saying there, which was about, I think, executive dysfunction, because when you can't predict the outcome of what's going to happen next, everything gets a lot harder. Jessica Cooper says, piggybacking off this topic of PDA, how prevalent is just executive dysfunction and OCD? I just remember reading about it once. I mostly have my OCD under control, but I have a lot of executive dysfunction in my day-to-day life, though I'm also getting tested for ADHD, autism, so it could be one of those leading to this problem too. So, is executive dysfunction and OCD, India, do you think there's a link?
I definitely do.
Oh, I'd let you answer that, Kate, because you're, is this your area? No?
Not particularly, no. We just produced a lot of slides and infographics around executive dysfunction and the impact of it. So it's really timely.
I can jump in just a little bit. So with sorry, my family. Executive function is a frontotemporal strategy that we use. I'm so sorry.
Day-to-day life.
And so in order to be able to access that front portion of your brain where all those executive functioning components kind of come together, you have to feel safe. The base brain is where the fight, flight, fright comes in. And if you make it through that check, then you have all the body stuff, which is in the midbrain. And there's so many checks that you have to go through that if your internal resources are just primed for survival, which I feel like a lot of with OCD, it's that feeling of survival. You really cannot access that front area of your brain, and therefore your executive function becomes disordered. Meaning you cannot neurologically access that part of your brain. So I can see where where people talk about the CBT or the logical thought process, you can't even get there. So.
Right.
Well, there's sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
There is, if you're operating, I've got a couple of things to add to this. If you're operating basically in a situation where you're hyper anxious, that does shut down rational thinking. I mean, that is what adrenaline does. It shuts down rational thinking because it doesn't want you to analyze when you're in a survival situation, whether, that car hurtling towards you, whether the trajectory you're going to be able to survive or the speed. It wants you to, it says two things. Number one, this is a real threat. And two, you need to do something. So it overrides that executive function. And there's also something else, Sarah, that you might find quite interesting to research. Is this thing called interoception in the body budget. Have you heard about that?
Oh, yes, she definitely has. We talk about it a lot on Neuroclassic, and that's a big focus of Sarah's work.
Oh, amazing. Because I love, and I did a podcast. It's on my YouTube channel, actually, with a specialist here, and he researches interoception in the body budget. And of course, when you're in those stages of acute anxiety, you go into shutdown because your body has used up, your brain is obviously using up an enormous amount of the body budget, and it literally just shuts down. And we will all sit here, and Jude, I know you will as well, have got to that point where it's like, I have to go to bed. I need to lie down. I'm done. I have nothing left. And I think that, plays a role in executive function, because if you're living in a survival mechanism, if you're living in that kind of, oh my God, you just don't, so executive function is the last thing you're worried about or can do.
Yeah, and that is, as I've been posting these disinhibition slides, OCD, motor apraxia, and ADHD all have the same parts of the brain implicated, the same neurotransmitters. And so I think that your corpus callosum that connects your left and right brain, your basal ganglia, and your prefrontal cortex there. And so I can tell you what it feels like to have parts of the brain that are extremely developed. So I've got this, almost savant level memory. But then other parts of the brain, my corpus callosum is insufficient. So my left and right hemispheres, I get traffic jams. The signals don't get to one side or the other where they need to go fast enough. And so I start experiencing like sensory derealization. I feel like I'm in a dream. Sounds start to morph into making no sense to me when I get too overwhelmed. And I can't, I had a test where they played 4 words, 2 in my left and 2 in my right ear. And they asked me to repeat them in order, and I got 60 out of 60 incorrect. Now I can remember things, long strings of information. So it wasn't that I couldn't remember. It's that my left and right brain were not communicating fast enough. And so that kind of structural difference in a person's brain, and that is a core feature of autism. Not every single autistic person has insufficient corpus callosum, or like most people you could imagine have like a 4-lane highway between their 2 brains, and I have like a footpath, right? A rocky footpath that you will wreck your bicycle trying to get from point A to point B. And it takes a long time for me to process. And so that whole not being able to sort and organize your thoughts, to see all the steps between, what would make you feel better and why you feel so upset right now and so uneasy and uncomfortable. Those are components of executive dysfunction. And when you can't do all this and you need an answer right now, that's where your OCD is kind of, or for people who have these struggles, is kind of born. And that inability to stop yourself too, sometimes from doing the compulsive things. And when we interact with non-speakers and we read from them, that was really when I began to understand myself as an autistic person, is when I started to become very immersed in the non-speaking community, because they were saying things like they want to eat, they're starving, and then they throw their plate on the floor. And then the next time they eat, they keep doing the same thing they did the last time as a compulsion. Or they'll fear that they're going to pull their shirt off, and then they do pull their shirt off. So it's like those OCD fears that a lot of people have, that they're going to expose themselves or they're going to do something embarrassing. One thing that I always had like intrusive thoughts to overturn tables when I'm sitting and eating with people. Every time there was just this thought like, you should overturn the table right now. There's a fork. You should take that fork and stab it as hard as you can into your hand and see what people do. I had no idea why I was like that. It's hilarious that my brothers also have the exact same kinds of thoughts. And when we're together at my poor parents, my brothers will text me and be like, I dare you to just take the soda that's sitting on the table and pour it across the table. And so we're all sending each other the messages of our intrusive thoughts because, well, we just didn't. It is genetic and it is wiring related. And I can say this from just interacting so much with the community and being a therapist for a few years, seeing the difference in autistic people, because most of our clients have been diagnosed as borderline personality disorder, but a lot of them were misdiagnosed and they were actually autistic. And I could see those differences too, where you had the people who had these executive dysfunction issues that made how they experience things different. But there were also so many similarities that when you can, use your pattern recognition and put things together of how they all, they might manifest differently, but they have similar brain origins. That was tangenting. Sorry.
No, that's good. It's really interesting actually, because I think this is the one area that they are doing some research on. It's kind of the neuroscience of OCD and autism, and they are, they're looking at the area of the brain and striatum, and they do think that there is a commonality between OCD and autism, and it is around this ability to stop behaviors. It's to do with has something to do with the reward circuits. I think the pathway, Kate, you might know this, it's the CTSC pathway that seems to be indicated for OCD and for autism.
And addiction.
And addiction.
Yeah,
absolutely.
All those right there with that striatum.
Yeah. That as Jude has said many times, that there is, the comorbidity, the overlap, it's extremely complicated. And that's why, reading a book like the DSM-5 criteria, which says, oh, you may have this according to 8 criteria. It's just so much more complicated than that. Diagnosing mental health is not a binary, phenomenon. It's very, very complicated. Everything's dimensional. And with OCD, it's heterogeneous. It will change. It can change just like that to something else.
So for people who have or may have OCD and who have these intrusive thoughts, one thing that we see a lot in the autistic community is people believing that everyone is angry, or they're going to be angry, they're going to hate them, they're a bad person. What kinds of advice would you give to people, especially if they don't have access to a good therapist? Because, as I'm sure you know, a bad therapist can cause a lot more problems than fix. And I've been there, and I'm sure Jude's been there, and probably most autistics have been there, where they've had actual trauma from therapy. What advice would you give for people who might not have the privilege or access to a great therapist to start supporting themselves?
Are you meaning the autistic community, or Sarah, or are you talking about the OCD community, or both?
Both. With these intrusive thoughts, especially the ones of being inadequate, not being good enough, everybody is going to hate you. You should never take up space in the world because it's going to be socially disastrous. Those kinds of thoughts.
Okay, well, we all know here, and you do too, this is long-term work, right? There's not a quick fix for this. And the first thing they need to do is to help themselves with some self-compassion. And a good place, actually, weirdly enough, how you and I met, it's a pretty good community on Instagram, to be honest. There are accounts such as Sarah's, such as yours, such as mine, And we do a fairly good job of getting the message out there is you are always good enough. Intrusive thoughts don't mean anything. Okay, we're not delivering specific treatment, and we're not allowed to do that via Instagram. We can only educate and raise awareness. But to start with feeling part of a community and that you're not on your own is huge. And that's the one thing social media does well. I'm not really recommending TikTok. I had some quite bad experiences posting on there as a therapist, including death threats. Yeah, it's dreadful. But Instagram is definitely helpful. I'm certainly going to follow Sarah's account. And I follow yours. So feeling part of something bigger, feeling that you're not on your own would be the first step. And then I would say that some really good reading might be, and I know this might be difficult for some people, especially the autistic community, but some really good reading. There's some great books out there. And I do say, try and focus on the solution, not the problem. So I wouldn't necessarily say read books about OCD, but read books that focus very much on the solution, that focus on either DBT or some CBT or some mindfulness or some acceptance commitment therapy. And actually DBT is quite good because it encompasses all of those. I quite like DBT as it covers all of those areas. So if possible, some books. The internet's a dangerous place. You can pick up some, so I'm not going to say go down that kind of YouTube tunnel. Where you might get misinformation. But if a book's been published, it will generally have been checked, and it will be by a clinician. So books are a good place to start. Support groups, local support groups, talking to people who are dealing with the same issues in your area, even if you've got to do it online, that's great. And if, as we've found out during lockdown, they don't have to be local to you. You can be talking to great people in Canada, and I'm in the UK, and you can join a support group. So that might be a good place to start. And maybe I've noticed that there's now a theme with books as well of having kind of workbooks. So of having books that you actually go through and you use skills. And also some of the websites, especially ours, we are trying to get more workshops, and some of our workshops are free. So if you go and look online, you might not be able to afford the therapy, but if you check the credentials of the practice or the therapists involved, have a look at their experience, read their blog, really reassure yourself that they know what they're talking about. See what free resources they've got. See whether they offer free workshops, see if they've got any materials to download. And we offer workshops to parents of people with OCD, to partners. We offer subtype specific workshops, and some of them are charged, but some of them aren't. And if someone emailed me and said, listen, I can't afford to pay for those, I'd be like, no worries, here you go, here's a free code. So looking for that kind, reaching out to people and seeing what's available would be really, really helpful. And there's lots more available than there used to be. There's a lot more available. And I would also say, look, if you don't have the resources, it won't hurt to actually email someone and say, I don't have the money to pay for sessions. Do you ever offer sessions for free, or do you offer special rates for us or discounts? And we do once a year. All of our therapists have to sign up to offer free therapy. And so we offer free therapy. We ask for people to come forward, and they do. And we will then treat them for free. So it's always worth reaching out and saying, could anybody help me? And also, of course, I keep forgetting, is that, in the UK, I don't know what it is like in any other area. There is treatment available, certainly in the UK, on the NHS. If you go to your doctor and you speak to your GP, there will be a waiting list, but they do offer therapy, and it's getting better. It has a bad reputation, I know, but it is getting better. They are actually offering things like DBT. They are offering treatment that's more condition specific. So I don't know if that's helpful, Tara. Is that the sort of thing you mean?
Yes, and I have been posting some of the there's actually a lived experience educator. I put it up as a banner. I'll put it back up. Just
Yeah.
created a DBT manual that is more appropriate for autistic and otherwise neurodivergent people, that takes into account things like alexithymia. I know some people pronounce that differently, but yeah, and and as a former DBT counselor, I really like that book. I got it myself. And then there's a series from Faith Harper. I'm not going to say what it's called, but that is up on the screen. F Your Brain, or Your Boundaries, Relationships. There's a whole series. They're very, yeah, Kate, show them. Thank you. They're very inexpensive, and they help you to create the right internal dialogues. A lot of what we're talking about is what Jude is focused on, and what his work with Neuroclastic is going to be focused on is decolonizing. And Jude, do you want to talk a little bit about how just this colonial mindset can really hurt everyone, and what it really means to decolonize your brain?
So a lot of the colonial mindset through white supremacy and capitalism has instilled a lot of individualism in us, that the pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality of that there's only one good way to exist in the society as a producer, and pretty much if you cannot adhere to that status quo for any type of reason, then you're not of worth in this society, and that you are deserving of the harm that is enacted upon you when you couldn't. So it also puts that on people who are better functioning, that they themselves too were deserving of the harm that they endured before they quote unquote were able to unlock the key to being like this good person who was of worth in the society. But all of that, it's a lie and demoralization underneath colonialism and white supremacy and capitalism, because your worth comes from your existence. It comes from the fact of in your humanity, and in your humanity, you have, though you may have common needs, you have individual needs. So, and you deserve to have that support and that accommodation and that care that comes from that. Even I feel like a lot of it that comes from it is like we encompass, especially with the nuclear family of you can only have like one other person to depend on, that to depend on to help with those, with your needs, with your support. A lot of the times, I know for myself, it's going to take more than one person a lot of times to bring that understanding and for the accommodation, because it's hard for me just to accommodate myself in myself. So rather than, it's about building community, and it's about questioning, am I adhering to this because it's healthy, or am I adhering to this because it's a part of the system that was set where I have to do this to be of worth? And so in understanding that your worth comes from your existence, in understanding that you're operating for a system that was more of not built for your health, but built for how you can produce, and more of it helps you to build more introspection and questioning for yourself. It's like, what can I actually do to navigate in the least stressful way? Like right now, I don't have these support and resources. So what can I actually do to navigate in a way that's most healthy for me right now? And how can I navigate in a way that's not only causing other harm, but also myself harm, at least in it's a harm reduction perspective, because since we still exist in this society, we're still going to undergo harm, and we're still going to undergo stress, especially when we still live in these stressful environments that are causing us harm. So it at least helps us start a revolution in ourselves and navigating. It's like, this isn't actually harmful. Somebody being uncomfortable by my tics, or somebody uncomfortable that it takes me so much time to get ready in the morning based off of my condition because I need more time, like that is more of a problem that they're imposing upon me. So if there's actually a way that I can navigate that more accommodating for me, then pick that if there's actually a way, and if there's a way where I'm in this environment and I can actually leave it, then I can pick that too. And I don't have to feel guilty about that, because I'm deserving to live. That a lot of the perspective that they put on us, that is that it's like we should be willing to die for this, that because we're such a burden on society, that it's okay for us to die. But that's honestly a form of eugenics and genocide for a lot of our disabled bodies. And so in decolonizing our mindset, it is learning that we are allowed to live, and that we are not the burden in society, that the burden is the struggle for survival in society, but us ourselves within that society, we are not the burden. And that we are allowed to come together and support each other to accommodate our common and individual needs, including communication, including it's like, how can I live with this OCD? Can you help support me through that, so that I am not hurting myself, so I'm not so stressed where it's wearing down my body, where you may not end to bring understanding, because what may stress you out a little bit may stress me out to the point that I'm shutting down, and that my life expectancy is less than yours, where I'm not expected to make it past this certain age. So it's decolonizing your mindset is actually learning how to live your life in the way that keeps you alive, that's not actively harming you, because a lot of our survival technique is actively harming us. So it's about finding the least stressful and the least harmful path that is accommodating for you, and making so you don't have to feel guilty about living and not wanting to die.
And I think another part of that Neuroclastic does, and that India is doing right now, and the other people on this panel, is that even though we all have disability, and some of us have lots of disabilities, myself included, there was no space for me to contribute or exist. I have all these disabilities. I have needs that most people don't have. But I also have this extreme desire to put good things into the world. And there was nowhere for me to do it, because I couldn't do it the way everyone else said that I should. And I couldn't do it without the supports that everyone thought I didn't need or deserve, because they couldn't see my disability. And so it's not just that we have inherent worth. We do. But it's also about building a community where we can contribute in ways that are okay for us. We don't have deadlines at Neuroclassic when people want to contribute something and they message and apologize 100 times. I tried to do it and I just couldn't. I'm so sorry. No, don't be sorry. We're perfectly and totally okay to accept this whenever you can do it, and that's great. Thank you for just being here and being a reader and caring and listening and wanting to help. And it's about taking down all of those unhealthy structural ideas about having to just be inherently biggest, fastest, strongest, most independent, and instead putting the focus on autonomy. Is you can contribute in the ways that work for you, in the time that works for you. And so yeah, that's the other end of that, is that you do also have a place where you can put good into the world, and that's there as well. So we have about 10 minutes left. Do we have any more questions from the audience?
I have somebody asking, in ERP, a therapist telling you how logically unlikely your fears would be seen as reassurance, no? Versus the showing your brain that there is no threat via exposure.
Right. I thought someone would ask this. So this is interesting, because Tara, when you were saying that your DBT therapist, the great task you did with the coins, we wouldn't actually do that with OCD. So that's very interesting. So it helped you, then shows that you with OCD and autism, that resonated for you and that worked. It was a visual, it really helped. Whereas, what Sarah's saying is quite right. We wouldn't do that. And we wouldn't go through percentages. We wouldn't do likelihood with people with just OCD. So Sarah's quite right. In ERP, we'd be more in that kind of mindset. Look, if it happened, you would cope, and I'll show you that you can tolerate that level of discomfort and you will be okay. And it might be that if you have autism and OCD, that might not work, that someone, and I think there's evidence that people with autism can't actually visualize that and can't think ahead to say, okay, I will cope. They can't even articulate sometimes how they're feeling in the moment. So you're right, Sarah, we wouldn't do that with just OCD. It would be seen as reassurance.
Right. And I think that the difference for me was that my fears were in no way related to, like, my socks should have no bearing on whether or not I was going to be arrested, or that my father 5 hours away was going to have a heart attack because of the socks that I wore. So there was a difference, I think, for me, because I couldn't, my intrusive thoughts were not, seemed to just come out of nowhere and have no, or if they did have some kind of logical bearing, there was no way I could get to them. That was so much cognitive work because of the brain differences that I have, that it was more about, like, let's look at a way that we can logically understand what the level of risk is, because everything seemed like such an extreme risk, and I couldn't, and autistic people have so many catastrophic things happen to them, and you hear a lot of autistic people saying it's like the universe is just out to get them, just all these terrible bad luck things. And so it does seem to, I mean, it's logical to believe that some horrible catastrophic things might happen, because they really do happen to us a lot. And we have so many people, they're being criminalized because they're autistic, and they've men especially being seen as, quote, creepy, and then people thinking that there was an autistic college student, and this made big news, who had given some people high fives and posed for selfies with them, and then later the girls, and this was a black student too, an autistic student, and so there was probably the ableism and the racism playing a part in that. But the young women, or the girls that posed for selfies, had just claimed they were creeped out, and he got suspended or expelled from college. And there have been a lot of times that there are just things that people can read those body language differences, and they project some kind of malice onto them. And so I think autistic people start to believe that they just inherently are malicious because so much gets projected onto them. And it was about helping me to predict better, I think, that I don't inherently cause the universe to do bad things. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's no one size fits all. It worked for you. We don't logic with people with OCD that don't have autism, but it worked for you. And there's, like Jude said, there's no one size fits all, and you have to adapt. You have to adapt the therapy.
It becomes more dangerous when there's a failure to adapt, when we stick rigidly to what we've been told and what we've been taught, and fail to see the human in front of us, and how, well, it's neurodiversity, right? There's an infinite number of
sticking to a
types of brain.
It's dangerous. You're right. You're absolutely right, Kate.
Okay, are there any closing thoughts that anyone wants to offer? Just first of all, thank you so much, India. This was amazing. You're wonderful, and I really hope that everyone can get can find a therapist or a counselor who is compassionate and who is willing to be flexible and see the human in front of them and come up with solutions that work for them. So thank you so much for this. Does anybody want to close out with any thoughts before we shut down for the afternoon, evening, depending on your time zone?
I just want to say thank you. I've learned a lot from you, and I really appreciate you being here with us.
Oh my goodness, thank you guys. I feel very lucky to have been here, and it's been really, really helpful. And I think, you know, what I take away from this is that, you know, we need to work harder. Certainly as therapists, we need to work harder, and we need to be backed up with solid research. And if we can change, you know, if we can change one person's life by doing these kinds of interactions, I would absolutely think that this was, you know, 500% worth it. And I think what all of you do is incredible. My specialist area is OCD, and I only really come across autism when it comes, when it's comorbid with OCD. But I've learned tonight, I've learned a lot. And Jude, thank you for your passion. It's incredible. You really, it's amazing.
I think you're right. I think we do need to be backed up by research, but we also need to acknowledge the gatekeeping of academia and research, and how lots of what we need to know isn't going to be in the papers and the journals, because it will never get there, because it's the lived experience of neurodivergent people, or, you know, lived experience. So yeah, I don't have a straightforward answer to that, but I think we need to acknowledge it as a profession.
It needs to be a combination of, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and that's true, and that's why I run a practice of therapists who have OCD. And you know, just listening to Sarah and Jude, it absolutely underlines the priority of doing that.
I'd like to say thank you as well, because honestly, especially after, because I'm also a health advocate for my neurodivergent friends with a lot of comorbid conditions, and just the hostility we get going to the doctor and actually like giving in-depth questions, and or giving us like, well, I looked this up, or like I've already had this treatment and it didn't work, and just like getting hit with that violence, getting hit with that wall, it is so invalidating and discouraging, which can, the stress and the trauma from that can just aggravate and cause the conditions to even worse, and horrible triggers for that. So this was very affirming, and a lot of times putting the language together for the things that I've been feeling and experiencing, and just all of it. Yes, especially a lot of this stuff, because of the gatekeeping, it's not funded. It's like considered experimental, and it's like, well, I don't agree with that. And it's like, you don't agree with me. You don't agree with the person you don't agree with me as a person, then, because it's happening to me. I'm experiencing this. Part of this is like who I am. And so if you don't agree with that, you don't agree with me, and you're inflicting violence upon me. So just like hearing this from somebody who like works with OCD and who has OCD, who has that kind of standing and experience, it's, that affirmation is really important, and I thank you for that, and thank you for this, coming to this discussion and bringing that.
Very happy to be here.
I also want to say thank you. And one of the things that's coming away from me is understanding, we've talked many times about the power of community, and the more that we gather together in these spaces and we share our experiences, our community is only growing and expanding, and this is the revolution. You know, we are, that there is a problem and we will solve it. And I'm just thankful for everybody and this opportunity to kind of, you know, to stand in our power, because like Jude says, we're born, it's our birthright. Who we are is our birthright. Like that, we are, and together, this is, sorry, my words are going away because I get chill bumps. But just thank you. I really appreciate it.
And with that, we will close. But I want to thank our amazing audience. You all are great, and we couldn't be where we are without all of you, and you're part of this community too. And we are going to continue our discussions and exploration and live stream about disinhibition in the future. We have some great things planned and some ideas brewing. So always let us know what you want to hear more of in the comments and what your questions are. And we are a responsive org. We're not great at planning because executive dysfunctioning, but that's a positive too, because we can respond with what you need instead of adhering to some strict schedule of we're rolling this content out at this time. We look at what you are saying in the comments and we respond to what you're saying that you don't have enough of and what you need more of. And so please always let us know. And thank you. Everybody have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.